Empezamos 15 minutos tarde, así que creo que vamos a ir acelerándonos en ciertos momentos. Hoy estamos absolutamente de fiesta en el MUAC por abrir la tercera edición de Museo Digital. En este caso, el título y el tema es Inteligencias y Artificios. Y prácticamente lo estamos pensando como un espacio para reimaginar museos en estas diferentes temporalidades y eras digitales. En esta tercera edición queremos explorar y cuestionar prácticas digitales en los museos de América Latina. Volver a preguntarnos si esas nociones corporativas sobre la inteligencia artificial o estas figuraciones sobre las brechas tecnológicas pueden tener una manera de ponerlas de cabeza a partir de pensar el museo como laboratorio y no occidentales. La manera en la que vamos a avanzar en la presentación es de la siguiente manera. Amanda de la Garza, directora general de Artes Visuales del MUAC, nos deja un mensaje videograbado para darles la bienvenida a ustedes y también a nuestros colaboradores. Y posteriormente, después del video, Nidia Chávez, directora de Fundación Telefónica Movistar México, y José Carlos Mariátegui, curador invitado del encuentro, darán unas palabras de bienvenida y también una articulación conceptual del evento. Entonces, sin más, creo que podemos irnos con el video y acabando con él regresamos.
Buenos días. Sean todos y todas bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la tercera edición de Museo Digital, el encuentro internacional organizado por Fundación Telefónica Movistar México y el Museo Universitario Arte Contemporáneo MUAC de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Desde el año 2017 hemos unido esfuerzos para reflexionar sobre las transformaciones y los retos del campo digital en los museos y las instituciones culturales alrededor del mundo. El título de nuestra primera edición fue Futuros y Posibilidades. La segunda llevó por nombre Ciudadanía y Cultura. La edición que ahora nos convoca disertará sobre inteligencias y artificios. Este desplazamiento conceptual da cuenta de un giro profundo tanto en las perspectivas y aproximaciones temáticas como en los afectos, temores y esperanzas que genera el campo digital. Para explorar este giro, tenemos la fortuna de que nos acompañen más de 15 especialistas, artistas, curadores, antropólogos, museólogos e investigadores, procedentes de países como Brasil, Canadá, Colombia, Costa Rica, España, México y Perú. A todos ellos les damos la más cordial bienvenida al MUAC y a la UNAM. Sabemos que su experiencia y sus conocimientos enriquecerán enormemente las conversaciones de estas dos jornadas intensivas. Esta edición, por supuesto, no sería posible sin la visión crítica del curador académico invitado de esta edición, el escritor, curador e investigador José Carlos Mariátegui. Muchísimas gracias, José Carlos. Gran parte de lo que se debatirá en estas jornadas tiene como disparador el tema que está cada vez más en la agenda mediática, cultural y artística, la inteligencia artificial. Es un tema que ya se desborda de su campo de producción más inmediato y se cuela en las conversaciones cotidianas en forma de filias o de fobias. Y es que lo que en un inicio era una promesa más o menos contenida sobre su importancia, es actualmente un vendaval de cambios que exigen discusiones de índole legal, política, ecológica, económica, ética, incluso existencial. Esto va más allá de una mera discusión de un nicho, digital o tecnológico. Es una mutación cultural e histórica. Los datos son contundentes y generan vértigo. De acuerdo con un informe reciente del Fondo Monetario Internacional, por ejemplo, en los años venideros, la inteligencia artificial afectará al 60% de los empleos de las economías avanzadas, amenazando por primera vez a los trabajadores con mayor cualificación, ya no solo a las bases laborales. Sin embargo, no es necesario especular con una afectación sofisticada ni a mediano plazo. Las implicaciones son muy concretas y en ciertos casos son crueles y alarmantes. No vayamos tan lejos. En estos momentos se están usando plataformas de inteligencia artificial como arma de guerra e instrumento necropolítico. Como se ve, el reto es mayúsculo, ya que involucra las coordenadas enteras de lo que hasta ahora entendemos como humano, incluidas, por supuesto, las coordenadas del arte. Es precisamente en el campo estético donde muchas de las problemáticas de la inteligencia artificial se expresan con mayor transparencia, donde los temores populares más inmediatos se materializan. Si los algoritmos escriben, pintan, actúan, hacen música, ¿qué le queda a los creadores? ¿No se suponía que tendría que ser al revés, que tendríamos que delegar a las máquinas todo aquello que no nos gusta hacer? Si las plataformas y sus dueños comienzan a monopolizar y capitalizar la creatividad colectiva, ¿cómo hacemos para que los temores del desplazamiento de una sensibilidad humana se transformen en herramientas críticas para su complejización? Existe un escenario donde los museos y los agentes culturales provean formas de debate que terminen incidiendo en nuestra manera de relacionarnos con la inteligencia artificial. ¿En qué términos tendría que llevarse esta discusión? ¿A qué velocidad? ¿Con qué fines? La edición de Museo Digital que nos convoca pretende abrir estas y muchas otras cuestiones de manera doblemente situada. Por un lado, busca aterrizar las discusiones en el museo, en este caso pensado como un laboratorio donde se ensayen preguntas, prácticas y modos de experimentar en conjunto. Por otro lado, busca que estas preguntas se generen desde nociones decoloniales, saberes no occidentales y perspectivas no humanas. Creemos que desde esta doble tensión pueden aparecer vías inéditas y más complejas para comprender los retos actuales, de modo que finalmente puedan reivindicarse las inteligencias dichas en plural. Inteligencias abiertas a todo tipo de intercambios de maneras más democráticas y justas y con perspectivas de un mejor futuro. Este programa inicia también las reflexiones sobre inteligencia artificial y otro tipo de saberes que constituyen las actividades del ALEF, Festival de Arte y Ciencia, organizado por la Coordinación de Difusión Cultural de la UNAM. Desde el museo agradecemos de forma muy calurosa a Nidia Chávez, directora de la Fundación Telefónica Movistar México, quien ha sido nuestra cómplice a lo largo de todos estos años para los encuentros de Museo Digital, las diferentes publicaciones, exhibiciones, y a su equipo de colaboradores, entre ellos a Javier Cano Nieto Sandoval y a Bárbara Perea, y por supuesto, como siempre y en todo momento, al equipo del MUAC que hace posible este y muchos otros eventos en el MUAC. Les damos nuevamente la bienvenida. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Lo bueno de ese aplauso es que se queda en digital y le podrá llegar también a Amanda. Y sin más me gustaría presentarles uno a uno las dos personas que, como ya adelantaba Amanda, hacen también posible desde sus lugares de trabajo este evento. En primer lugar quiero presentar a Nidia Chávez, directora de Fundación Telefónica Movistar México. Ella es venezolana y mexicana por naturalización, licenciada en Comunicación Social por la Universidad Cecilio Acosta y maestra en Estudios de Discurso por la Universidad Central de Venezuela. Cuenta con 21 años de trayectoria profesional en el sector de las telecomunicaciones, desde donde ha desarrollado proyectos culturales, educativos y sociales con foco en transparencia, innovación social y sostenibilidad. Es directora de Fundación Telefónica Movistar México desde noviembre de 2016. Comenzó su trayectoria en esta institución en 2011 como responsable del Departamento de Arte y Tecnología en Fundación Telefónica Venezuela. En 2012 llega a México para asumir la gerencia de divulgación del conocimiento de la Fundación y posteriormente la dirección. Durante 12 años de su carrera, estuvo involucrada en las áreas de negocios, comunicación corporativa y responsabilidad social en la Compañía Anónima Nacional Teléfonos de Venezuela. Actualmente, forma parte de 2 comunidades de liderazgo femenino, Conectadas, una red que impulsa a las mujeres del sector de las telecomunicaciones, y MUX-ED, una alianza que integra la visión de equidad de género en materia educativa en México. Nidia, muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy.
Gracias, Julio. Muy buenos días, sean bienvenidas y bienvenidos. En nombre de Fundación Telefónica Movistar México, agradecemos al MUAC por abrirnos nuevamente los brazos para vivir esta tercera edición del encuentro internacional, listos para renovar bríos y aprendizajes, además de estar orgullosos de esta alianza que para nosotros es muy, muy importante. Aliados del prestigio del MUAC y la UNAM nos permiten expandir el conocimiento e invitar a reflexionar en las diferentes vertientes de la sociedad digital en la que vivimos, en esta transformación que estamos viviendo y en este caso desde el ámbito cultural. Quiero darle las gracias de manera muy especial a Amanda de la Garza, directora de este magnífico recinto, nuestra anfitriona, y a todo su equipo, empezando por nuestro querido Julio García. Y a todas las personas que han hecho posible desde el MUAC y desde Fundación Telefónica Movistar México que hoy vivamos esta tercera edición. Me encanta el nombre de la nueva edición, Museo Digital, Inteligencias y Artificios. Es un título que nos hace llegar con aprendizajes, aciertos y también con muchos errores que nos animan para seguir intentando construir referentes y hacernos referentes en esta discusión sobre los procesos de digitalización de los museos. Por supuesto, vamos a hacer un énfasis en esos retos y oportunidades que este esfuerzo conlleva. Reimaginar los museos en este actual contexto a la luz de nuevos conocimientos y avances tecnológicos con retrospectivas en las ediciones del 17 y 2020. Sin duda define que el resultado que obtendremos será un aporte de inconmensurable valor para la actividad museística de México, del país, de la cultura contemporánea y su estrecha relación con la tecnología, el arte y las humanidades de toda la región y del mundo. Tal y como lo hizo Amanda, queremos también agradecer la participación de expertos de Perú, Brasil, Canadá, Colombia, Costa Rica, España y México, a quienes también agradecemos su presencia. Ya lo comentaba Amanda en sus palabras, hay un reto y el reto es seguir pensando juntos, discutir, y en el caso del Museo Digital estas discusiones y saberes quedarán plasmados, tal como en las 2 ediciones anteriores, en un libro homónimo. Un documento que más allá de su valor por su parte del conocimiento representa una fructífera alianza que hemos construido y consolidado a lo largo de todo este tiempo. Quiero dar, por supuesto, también la bienvenida a José Carlos Mariategui, nuestro curador invitado, y un actor clave para esta edición. Muchas gracias, José Carlos. Bienvenido. Durante todos estos años, para nosotros ha sido fundamental la relación con el MUAC, porque nos ha permitido aprender y como instituciones ser parte de un colectivo a quien le interesa, le importa, en este caso, la cultura digital. La invitación es a que lo disfruten, a que disfruten este esfuerzo. Nos ilusiona enormemente, por supuesto, lo que viviremos durante estas 2 jornadas, y agradecer enormemente a quienes se están sumando de manera presencial y a quienes nos siguen a través de la transmisión que estamos viviendo. Muchísimas gracias. Nuevamente la invitación es a disfrutarlo.
Y bueno, ya lo hemos nombrado varias veces. José Carlos Mariátegui es curador invitado de esta edición. Él es escritor, curador y docente en cultura y tecnología. Estudió biología y matemáticas y tiene una maestría y doctorado en sistemas de información e innovación, ambos por la London School of Economics and Political Science. Es fundador de Alta Tecnología Andina, ATA, dedicada a proyectos en arte, ciencia y tecnología en América Latina. Es profesor en LUISS de Roma, Senior Research Fellow en London School of Economics and Political Science y Board Member de Future Everything del Reino Unido. Es presidente del Comité de Educación del Museo de Arte de Lima, Mali, donde además lidera su estrategia digital. Ha publicado en revistas como AI and Society, Third Text, The Information Society, Telos y Leonardo. Su investigación multidisciplinar abarca la arqueología de los medios, la cibernética, la digitalización, archivos y el impacto de la tecnología en instituciones de memoria. Ha coeditado un número especial de AI and Society sobre cibernética en América Latina en 2022 y realizado una investigación sobre colecciones del videoarte en América Latina para el libro Encounters in Video Art in Latin America por el Getty Research Institute. Ha comisariado proyectos de arte y tecnología a nivel internacional durante más de 2 décadas. Recientemente ha curado la exposición Rosa Barba, evocando un espacio más allá del cine, y es parte del equipo curatorial de Arteónica, Art, Science and Technology in Latin America Today, que se inaugura próximamente, que se inaugura en el 2024 en el proyecto LALA de Pacific Standard Time del Getty Research Institute. Y bueno, creo que podría seguir y seguir. Sí. José Carlos, para el MUAC y Fundación Telefónica es sin duda un honor plantear este modelo de museo digital que nos vienes a regalar y acelerar la cabeza. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Amigos, autoridades, Nidia Chávez, directora de Fundación Telefónica Movistar, México, Amanda de la Garza, omnipresente en el medio digital, directora de la Dirección General de Artes Visuales del Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, colegas, amigos. Cuando hace unos meses Amanda de la Garza me invitó a curar académicamente este encuentro, conversamos con el equipo del MUAC y Fundación Telefónica México sobre qué contribuciones originales podrían venir desde América Latina para la definición del museo del siglo XXI. La pregunta es compleja, pues en realidad esconde múltiples capas que nos encargamos de desplegarlas. Algunas de esas preguntas son la plataforma sobre la cual hemos organizado este evento. Como, por ejemplo, cómo se sustenta la producción cultural, especialmente en el entorno digital en el siglo XXI, de qué forma podemos explorar los contenidos que se orientan por la intuición y la curiosidad de nuestro público en un vasto universo de datos. ¿Deben los museos considerarse principalmente emisores de contenido? ¿Hasta qué punto los museos perciben y analizan el impacto de la digitalización y los medios digitales en la comprensión del comportamiento e intereses de sus audiencias? Y por último, ¿cómo influye el impacto de la digitalización y de la inteligencia artificial en la gestión, creación y estructura organizacional de los museos? Entonces, para esta tercera edición del Encuentro Internacional Museo Digital y bajo el título de Inteligencias y Artificios, buscamos explorar las experiencias y casos concretos sobre el terreno digital desde América Latina, con el fin de identificar el desarrollo de la región y cómo puede aportar sustancialmente en la discusión global. Si bien desde América Latina existe una revisión crítica y aportes originales en relación al papel que deben de cumplir los museos en el siglo XXI, incluyendo el proceso de descolonización de los museos y la resignificación de sus patrimonios, tanto material como inmaterial, Cuando se abarcan temas digitales y de nuevas tecnologías, el contexto de subordinación o dependencia de las prácticas desarrolladas a partir de un modelo occidental universal o universal occidental se hace evidente. Paradójicamente, esto no sucede cuando hablamos de la rica historia del arte y la tecnología o la historia de la cibernética, campos en donde América Latina ha tenido un papel pionero. Y permítanme detenerme aquí para hacer una referencia a la historia de la cibernética que puede servir como ejemplo. En la década del 40, el neurofisiólogo mexicano Arturo Rosenbluth trabajaba en el laboratorio de fisiología de Harvard con Walter Cannon y propuso una teoría química de la transmisión sináptica en el sistema nervioso central. Durante su estancia en Boston, Rosenbluth entabló una estrecha amistad con el matemático Norbert Wiener y juntos iniciaron una serie de seminarios sobre el funcionamiento y homologación de sistemas de control y el estudio del comportamiento entre máquinas y organismos vivientes. En el 43, junto a Wiener y a Julian Bigelow, Rosenbluth lideró la coautoría del estudio Comportamiento, Propósito y Teología, considerado por muchos, incluyendo la antropóloga cultural estadounidense Margaret Mead, como el primer gran texto sobre cibernética. Si bien el término cibernética adquirió notoriedad internacional gracias a la obra de Norbert Wiener y su libro Cybernetics, este libro abre con una dedicatoria a Rosenbluth en reconocimiento a su larga colaboración, ya que parte de dicho libro fue concebido y escrito en México durante una de las estancias de Wiener en esa ciudad. Por eso me alegra poder decir aquí que la cibernética nació en México. Las ideas cibernéticas siguen siendo relevantes hoy y permiten cambiar por completo las dinámicas de la educación, el conocimiento, la cultura y la investigación científica. Problematizar los procesos socioculturales también ayuda a formular modelos en los que los artefactos técnicos se relacionan con formas de conocimiento ancestral y narrativas de ficción, habitando y coexistiendo en entornos sociales problematizados, produciendo artefactos híbridos, como los trabajos que realizan muchos de los artistas latinoamericanos, y vale mencionar aquí también el apoyo decisivo por décadas y sostenido de Fundación Telefónica en el desarrollo del arte y la tecnología en América Latina. Como menciona Auric Halpern en su libro Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason since 1945, todas las formas de mediación tecnológica traducen la información y la memoria en unidades estandarizadas y maleables. Estos criterios imponen una perspectiva particular de ver el mundo y suelen ocultar procesos automatizados y carentes de sensibilidad, los cuales tienen el potencial de reducir la complejidad de la realidad a un mero conjunto de datos que se conectan técnicamente entre sí. Por ejemplo, los sistemas computacionales muchas veces no se ajustan con otros tipos de conocimientos no universales occidentales, donde existe una mediación técnica entre la metafísica y las culturas. Aquí el filósofo chino Yu Hui creó un concepto llamado cosmotécnica. Su punto de partida es una crítica a la visión de la tecnología como algo antropológicamente universal. Para él, esto no siempre es así. Las tecnologías siempre deben ser incrustadas en las cosmologías particulares en las que se crearon. Esto va más allá de la mera funcionalidad y el utilitarismo. No es que exista una sola tecnología, sino múltiples. De esa manera, si hay una pluralidad de cosmotécnicas, también debemos construir una visión de nuevas tecnologías como la inteligencia artificial que permitan la orquestación de diferentes cosmotécnicas. No es que exista entonces una inteligencia, sino múltiples inteligencias. Para ello necesitamos también la experimentación artística con el fin de decolonizar la visión occidental universalista en relación a la tecnología. Necesitamos abogar por el desarrollo de sistemas de información que tengan en cuenta cosmotécnicas diversas, conocimientos ancestrales, preservando así el mundo natural y poniendo en evidencia el papel que cumplen las inteligencias de los ríos, de los animales, las plantas, pero también su vínculo con las lenguas y las mitologías, en lo que podría definirse como una simbiosis relacional del conocimiento planetario. De la misma forma, las tradiciones sociológicas desarrolladas en buena parte del siglo XX en América Latina también son hoy utilizadas para poder entender la lógica subyacente en la tecnología y los datos. El sociólogo peruano Aníbal Quijano desarrolló un enfoque decolonial asociado a una crítica a la racionalidad universal occidental. Esta última, señalaba Quijano, borra la diferencia y la recuperación de racionalidades alternativas que se basen en el respeto a la diferencia. Estas ideas y otras están en la misma dirección y han sido cultivadas por otros intelectuales latinoamericanos en las últimas décadas y han sido centrales para la tesis sobre el colonialismo de datos, que se basa en la apropiación continua, desmesurada, violenta y con fines de lucro de recursos de información a una escala global. Los algoritmos están dando forma a una nueva percepción de la cultura, donde nuestra perspectiva cultural está mediada por el mecanismo de filtrado de nuestros feeds de noticias y redes sociales, de la clasificación de nuestros resultados de búsquedas, la priorización de la información a partir de mecanismos de recomendación. Y si bien los algoritmos son asombrosos para explorar la información, siguen estando detrás de la creatividad humana cuando se trata de plantear argumentos alternativos. Hasta ahora son mucho mejores identificando y reproduciendo patrones que produciéndolos. Esta suerte de cultura a partir de algoritmos viene asociada por el deseo de satisfacer las demandas de los públicos, pero a expensas de sacrificar la discusión crítica, que como bien menciona Mike Pepe, busca adaptarse hacia un enfoque en el que los usuarios perciben a las instituciones simplemente como un conjunto de datos o de archivos de imágenes, es decir, como meros proveedores de información. La relevancia de lo digital colisiona con la noción tradicional de los museos como espacios que resguardan colecciones de objetos y rescatan su capacidad para trascender las limitaciones convencionales del espacio y tiempo. La integración de tecnologías digitales enriquece la experiencia del visitante proporcionando capas adicionales de información, contextos interactivos y conexiones que amplían y profundizan su comprensión. En lugar de ser meros receptores pasivos de un discurso curatorial, las audiencias se benefician así de una amplitud de información que les otorga la libertad de construir sus propias historias e interpretaciones. Se trata así de plantear condiciones para una verdadera liberación y una independencia de los modelos establecidos, entendiendo la participación creativa como un medio para forjar una nueva sociedad. En respuesta a estas problemáticas, este encuentro internacional, Museo Digital, Inteligencias y Artificios, en este encuentro buscamos explorar y cuestionar las prácticas digitales y generar espacios para reimaginar los museos en el siglo XXI. Para ello, a lo largo de estos 2 días intensos, además de conferencias magistrales, casos, hemos planteado 2 paneles de discusión con temas que se enriquecen y comunican mutuamente, como vasos comunicantes. Presencial y abre paso a un enfoque holístico. La utilización de la tecnología, la recopilación y el análisis de datos juegan un papel central en la definición del museo como un laboratorio de conocimiento en constante evolución, que a partir de pruebas y aprendizajes toma decisiones informadas y adaptativas. Una cuestión importante es el reconocimiento del rol crucial de los artistas o los artistas investigadores en este proceso. Más allá de ser simples proveedores de contenidos, los artistas se convierten en participantes activos que contribuyen a comprender las dinámicas del museo tanto a nivel interno como en relación a sus públicos, con el objetivo de generar un museo más inclusivo. El encuentro internacional, Museo Digital, Inteligencias y Artificios, plantea estos temas considerando que desde América Latina se han dado aportes relevantes y originales y pioneros, tanto en el pasado como en el presente, pero que muchas veces no se han llegado a visibilizar. En el contexto de una revolución tecnológica impactada por el uso de la inteligencia artificial, la transformación de los espacios digitales ha adquirido una relevancia crucial en todas las esferas. En ese sentido, buscamos identificar cómo se relacionan los artistas con la inteligencia artificial en sus obras, cuál es el papel de las organizaciones culturales que trabajan con la inteligencia artificial y cómo puede contribuir el museo a las discusiones actuales sobre regulación, gobernanza y ética de la inteligencia artificial. Finalmente, ¿de qué manera el museo puede utilizar este conjunto de tecnologías que hoy dependen de datos y contenidos muchas veces extraídos del Internet para enriquecer su función cultural y educativa, sin caer en la simple adopción acrítica que nos imponen las herramientas tecnológicas comerciales. Ahora más que nunca surge la imperativa tarea que desde el museo no solo desarrollemos estos entornos, sino también los debamos comprender y analizarlos críticamente. Son los dos temas que vamos a tratar, cruzan y entrecruzan estos aspectos, y para ello contamos con un grupo de invitados internacionales que estamos seguros que aportarán desde sus experiencias individuales a construir esta historia. Sarah Diamond, de Canadá, investigadora y presidente emérita del Ontario College of Art and Design University. Ulises Mejías, investigador mexicano y profesor de estudios de comunicación en la SUNY de Oswego, en los Estados Unidos. Priscila Molina, curadora de arqueología de los museos del Banco Central de Costa Rica. Juan Cortés, que estará en línea, artista, programador y educador colombiano. Bruno Moreschi, investigador y artista visual brasileño, actualmente en el Collegium Helveticum, un proyecto en conjunto entre el Institute of Advanced Studies de la ETH de Zúrich y la Universidad de Zúrich y la Universidad de las Artes de Zúrich. Roberto Sariquiei, doctor en lingüística y profesor de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Fernanda Pita, profesora y jefa de catalogación y documentación del Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de la Universidad de Sao Paulo en Brasil. Luz María Bedoya, artista, investigadora y docente peruana. Luis Martínez, director de la Biblioteca de la Fundación Juan March en España. Y nos acompañan además en las moderaciones y comentarios distinguidos expertos locales. Tania Edo, coordinadora de la cátedra Max Aub, transdisciplina de arte y tecnología aquí en la UNAM. Federico Pérez Villoro, artista e investigador. Cintia García Leiva, directora de la Casa del Lago Juan José Arreola de la UNAM. Y el equipo de Telefónica Movistar México y el MUAC, a quienes quiero agradecer muy especialmente, pues ha sido muy estimulante trabajar con un grupo humano tan profesional, creativo y cuestionador. Julio García Murillo, Guillermo García Pérez, Mariel Vela, Javier Cano y Bárbara Perea, compañeros en este proyecto, y a todos los trabajadores del MUAC que han sido parte de este esfuerzo. Quiero finalizar con otra breve referencia a la historia de la cibernética, pero esta vez se trata de un brasileño y latinoamericano. Darcy Ribeiro fue uno de los más lúcidos antropólogos de América Latina. Vivió una década con los indios Caribú, Ufahue y Urubu Capor. Su extenso trabajo de campo le proporcionó valiosos conocimientos sobre las culturas tradicionales y modos de vida, y sentó las bases de una de sus contribuciones más significativas a la cultura brasileña, la fundación del Museo del Indio en Río de Janeiro. Darcy fue también el primer rector de la Universidad de Brasilia. Tenemos que entender o pensar el grado de convencimiento que ejerció para convencer a 200 docentes que se muden a un nuevo proyecto en medio de la selva. Además, tuvo cargos políticos. Fue ministro de Educación del presidente João Goulart en el 62, luego fue jefe de la Casa de Gobierno en el 63, y en el 64, luego del golpe militar que depone a Goulart, Ribeiro inicia un exilio largo que lo lleva a Uruguay, Venezuela, Chile y Perú. Ese largo proceso de más de una década lo convierte en latinoamericano. En Uruguay, Ribeiro se relacionó con muchos intelectuales y científicos latinoamericanos, y en particular con el argentino Manuel Sadowski, reconocido como uno de los pioneros en introducir las computadoras para la formación e investigación académica en América Latina. La influencia de Sadowski permitió que en el Perú Darcy fundara el Centro de Estudios de la Participación Popular, el primer think tank público peruano, y con la ayuda del matemático argentino Oscar Barsavsky y otros colegas, desarrollara un modelo computacional global para la sociedad peruana. En Darcy Ribeiro confluyen muchos de los temas que vamos a ver en estos 2 días: los museos, la tecnología, los datos, las otras inteligencias artificiales, el conocimiento indígena y la tradición del pensamiento intelectual latinoamericano. Pero más allá de ello, nos hace reflexionar sobre la importancia de la autonomía intelectual, y que para ello se requiere no solo originalidad, sino hoy se requiere una crítica a la tecnología y los medios. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, José Carlos. Y me parece fundamental poder arrancar con estas también 2 referencias que abres, ¿no? Tanto Rosenbluth como Ribeiro, como, digamos, amuletos discursivos que nos ayuden a dar por inaugurada Museo Digital, Inteligencias y Artificios. A lo largo de la jornada vamos a, como ya lo planteaba José Carlos, vamos a tener distintos formatos de trabajo. Nos sigue ahora la conferencia magistral de Sarah Diamond. Después tendremos un coffee break para pasar al primer caso de estudio con Priscila Molina. Al lado de mí hay una mesa con post-its y stickers. Una cosa que nos interesa que podamos desarrollar a lo largo de la conferencia es que si existieran comentarios específicos ligados a las conferencias o a las maneras de imaginar la relación de cultura digital con museos, podamos ir llenando ese muro negro que tienen ustedes a su derecha. Y al final de los 2 días de la jornada nos interesa saber también cuáles son los comentarios, además evidentemente de todas las sesiones de preguntas y respuestas. Aunque ya estamos sobre el tiempo, algo que también nos interesaba para este encuentro era tener horarios holgados para dejar que las conversaciones se pudieran desarrollar. Sin más, muchas gracias Nidia, José Carlos, por esta presentación y no se muevan de sus lugares. Vamos a pasar de inmediato a la siguiente mesa. Muchas gracias.
Hola, Mexico City. Wow. I'm so pleased and honored to be here. Now, I realize I have to sort of point myself here to see the slides and tell them when to change it, but perhaps we could go to the second slide now. Great, thank you. I want to, first of all, really talk about how museums and galleries have a responsibility and opportunity to reshape the ways that they act in relation to Indigenous histories, knowledges, languages, and living cultures. Non-Indigenous actors within these must function as allies. And the Dish with One Spoon Treaty represents the shared responsibility in the place that I come from, which is Toronto, where I live right now, Takaranto, between the Mississauga of the Credit and other Indigenous groups who were there, including the Huron-Wendat and the people of other treaties who themselves signed an agreement before there was contact to ensure that the land and the waters were taken care of. And then through negotiations with the settler communities, this treaty was expanded. So the principle of it is that you live on the land, you have responsibility for the land and its people. So I thought it would be important to say that. I'm hoping at some point in the conference somebody will provide a land acknowledgement for the peoples of Mexico City who are the custodians of this land and still, I'm sure, very engaged with its culture and its life. So I'll continue. So non-Indigenous actors, as I said, within these worlds of the museum, the academy, and so on, we must function as allies. There is responsibility to address colonial legacies of expropriation, appropriation, human, cultural, and environmental destruction. We'll go to the next slide. Rethinking and remaking institutions is relevant for all aspects of practice. Oops. Ooh, exciting. There we go. For all aspects of practice, historical and contemporary exhibitions and their curation, artist in residency programs, collections, technology adoption, metadata description, staffing, collaborative partnerships, and audiences. And partnership opportunities can engage integrative futurist worldviews that think forward 7 generations to imagine and take responsibility for the consequences of contemporary decisions, and respect for place, introduce a culture of care and celebration, and the dynamic application of technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning in an era of digitized records and images. Jessica Bradley is a theorist of archival practices and an expert in AI applications for archives, and she sees AI as a set of tools that can support archivists in increasing discovery and access to collections of archival images. Her thoughts are relevant for museums. She notes, and I quote, "Exploratory research into AI tools and archival practice offers the potential to develop methods for harnessing machine learning to assist in activities of archival description and improve access to archival collections. This will be especially important when developing archival access systems aimed at sharing information and collections between archives and with different communities such as artists, BIPOC, and I'm not sure that term is used in Latin America, but Black, Indigenous people of color, researchers, and historically marginalized groups. However, AI applications could equally and easily continue to propagate stereotypes, misdescribe Indigenous historical and contemporary objects, appropriate data and sacred or community-based images and objects to databases used by large learning, by LLMs, without permission, encourage a culture of appropriation, which I said already, and efficiency rather than collaboration. So we have a huge challenge with the appropriation of Indigenous images across sort of the global economy of image sharing and commercialization. So I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. Good, we'll stay there. Okay, so what is an ally? Well, allyship is a continuous process of learning about a range of identities and lived experiences and taking courageous action to create a more equitable and inclusive world. It means taking direction from marginalized communities about their needs, their cultures, their worldviews, and supporting their abilities to realize these within institutions, whether universities or museums, or within the very technologies that we create and use. And what is an ethics of care? An ethics of care is a concept that aligns well with allyship. While it emerged sort of between the archive sector and the health sector, I believe it carries over into museums, galleries, and other institutions in relation to collections and records. This concept was developed by Michelle Caswell and Marissa Seafor, who in 2016 issued a challenge to archivists to shift their thinking about archival ethics from an individual rights-based model, so in other words, who owns the collection, who owns the document, to a more relational feminist ethics of care where people were more important than records. And they state, and I quote, "In a feminist ethics of care approach, archivists are understood and understand themselves as caregivers bound to record creators, subjects, users, and communities through a web of mutual effective responsibility based on radical empathy. The most vital archival responses will be marked by care. Care for the most oppressed people who create, use, and steward records, and care for each other." Now, end of quote. Now, these thoughts seem relevant to museums and galleries which address a much wider and diverse audience than archives do. And ethics of care seems particularly cogent as institutions adopt AI and machine learning to manage collections and audiences, considering collection items that were not donated by marginalized groups, their choice about those groups, their choice of artists, curatorial inclusion, and audience construction. So let's talk for a moment about social infrastructure and museums and Indigenous engagement. So another way of thinking about this is the concept of social infrastructure, defined as the organizational arrangements and deliberate investments in society's systems, relationships, and structures that enable a resilient, just, equitable, and sustainable world. It includes social, economic, environmental, and cultural assets. Infrastructure is understood to be physical, human, and virtual. I always point up to the cloud. So I always look up to the cloud when it's a whole bunch of servers that are actually in a building somewhere. Infrastructure is understood to be physical, human, and virtual resources dedicated to the public good. This concept holds relevance for museums. Before discussing AI and some of the related digital initiatives in tool building, such as relational databases or collaborative museum and archive practices, let's share examples of the ways that museums and galleries have shifted their practices to build relationships with Indigenous and rights-deserving communities. So one of the most important, this is great, we'll go to the next slide, thank you. One of the most important social infrastructure initiatives in recent years is the convening of dialogues regarding repatriation and restitution as they relate to Indigenous cultures as well as artifacts that were stolen from Africa and Latin America and other places. In response to calls for repatriation and the decolonization of university museums, but also larger public institutions. Teely Nell discusses the imperative for museums, and I quote, "For centuries, expressions of colonialism, oppression, domination, subjugation, suppression, slavery, extraction, and even eradication and destruction of heritage have filled the coffers of many museum collections on a global scale," unquote. UMAC, which is the forum for these those working in university museums and related organizations, I just have a bit of a sniff always. Within ICOM, the International Council of Museums has made these issues a priority through its project, quote, "The Ethics of Restitution and Repatriation," unquote, and has drafted guidelines for restitution and return of items from university museums and collections, which references UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. UMAC also focused its 2021 conference on the topic and noted that initiatives are only effective when pursued in concert with Indigenous and other communities whose histories and artifacts are represented within those collections. Digital-rich virtual representations of collections, and searchable metadata are truly an alternative to physical objects once they are repatriated. So we don't have to lose that history to a larger audience, but we can represent that history in different ways. So sometimes social infrastructure building through repatriation or decolonization is focused on cultural change, both within and without the museum. And I'm going to give you a series of examples. And we'll just go to the next image. Okay, thanks. We'll stay there, but I'm going to talk about another example first. So museums continue to hold collections, but the stewardship shifts. So in other words, there are many, many situations where collections will remain within a museum, within an archive, but the relationship with Indigenous original owners of those objects or those data is truly transformed into either co-ownership or they own the data, they own the objects, and it's negotiated stewardship loan to the museum or the archive. And we'll kind of talk about data later. We're going to have a date with data a bit later on. So there's an initiative at the University of Melbourne's Museums and Cultural Commons called Black Core, and it's a collective driven by First Nations methodologies, research, and cultural practices that focuses on Wolamara, that is protection, Yindamara, Gunhana, ongoing respect, and Moran Gidyal, which is healing. The vision of Black Core is to realize systematic change by reimagining how First Nations knowledges, cultural materials, and communities are held within institutional spaces of museums, galleries, and the universe. It's led by Professor Brooke Andrew, who is an Indigenous scholar, and he's the director of Reimagining Museums and Collections, and its goals are to provide museum fellowships, to support projects in communities, so this idea of working in community, and to create an archive and nurture systematic change within the Department of Museums and Collections itself. OCAD University's on-site gallery has chosen to concentrate its efforts on Indigenous exhibition and now is directed by Mohawk Executive Director Ryan Rice, who brought OCAD University his experience as director of the Museum of the Santa Fe Institute for American Indian Arts, where he transformed the museum from its focus on regional craft to include a very deep dialogue with contemporary North American Indigenous art. Two major museums in Canada also hold a focus on Indigenous content and exhibitions with close ties into community. And that means that there are interns, there are learners, there's a sort of reciprocity with activities and events that happen in community and in museum. So the Mackenzie Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan is led by John G. Hampton, who's Chickasaw and mixed European descent, and holds a record as the longest and deepest champion of contemporary Indigenous art in the world, with over 100 exhibitions dedicated to Indigenous art since 1975, as well as a really long record of really prestigious Indigenous staff, including the chief curators and a massive, massive Indigenous collection. It's also a center for new media exhibition with commissions of Indigenous digital artists. The Winnipeg Art Gallery, Kwagajug, is home to the largest Inuit contemporary art collection in the world, with a new building dedicated to this collection, and a leader in Indigenous ways of learning, Julia Lafreniere, who's in charge of exhibition and community partnerships, including a formal partnership with the government of Nunavut, which is the Inuit territory in Canada's Arctic. Amelie Shangar, I will go to the next image. Oh, we can stay here for a sec, and you can contemplate that, and then we'll go to the next one. Amelie Shangar was the long-time curator at the Art Gallery of York University, and is now a director of the Agnes Etherington Gallery, and she discusses the ways that as a woman of color in museum leadership, and we can go to the next slide, she questioned, quote, assimilationist, unquote, practices that asked Indigenous or racialized communities to adapt to the culture of galleries or museums or universities rather than institutions adapting towards them. She coined this term, which I love, it's called in-reach, stating, quote, contrary to outreach, in-reach puts responsibilities on the gallery to learn how to work with communities and not the other way around, unquote. She shared through her now more than a decade-long collaboration with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which began in 2009, with the Awakening Gigzomahan project, which was a series of parades and performance events. She talks about how she experienced, quote, how limited the legacies of the Western Museum were when we are required to respond to different worldviews, unquote. And the collaboration resulted in a new civic ceremony with a collaboration between young parkour athletes, super popular in North America. I'm not sure about it in Latin America, but that's essentially athletic dance performances throughout the infrastructure of the city and the Mississauga. Mario Xavier Curie has identified Brazilian museums that hold Indigenous archaeological, anthropological, ethnographic, and ethology collections, noting that few of these are in territories with significant Indigenous populations. And she demonstrates a shift in the practices of university museums towards what she calls, quote, co-musealization initiatives, and we'll go to the next slide, with Indigenous groups that involve different expert skills in the practice of university museums that are typically conservation, documentation, education, and administration. And she makes a special contribution for the update of collections management policies, which she sees as a crossroad of institutional policy, museological, anthropological, and archaeological thinking, and museological practice, committed to ethics without forgetting that that, quote, she said, we are communicating with a range of social groups, unquote. So Indigenous agency and self-representation in museums is emerging, quote, as a new subject matter in the museological field. That is a meta-object of socially recognizable forms deriving from a specific social technology, unquote, according to Aramis Silva. Curie, going back to her, describes the evolution of MAE USEP, so University of Sao Paulo's Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography, their practices through the Resistance Now exhibition, Resistance Now strengthening and uniting Indigenous with Kaingang, Guarani, Nanwada, and Tirana cultures exhibition. So Indigenous collaborators intervened to change the museum's approach. They didn't like it. They required that video testimonials be collected and that these be unscripted and used to drive exhibition planning. Indigenous partners also identified objects. We'll go to the next. Excellent, thank you. Identified objects that had been misidentified by anthropologists and ethnographers in the collection, such as this midwife's robe. And Curie notes that, quote, the less the museum intervened from a position of authority, the more the Indigenous groups conducted the process in their own way, talking on their own behalf, talking about their situation, and playing the role of researchers of their own culture. The more the museum's team got involved in the collaborative initiative, which comprised listening to, socializing with, and showing respect for and trusting the other, end of quote. Also in Brazil, the Museum of the Portuguese Language, the MLP, recently held the exhibition Nehe e Pora, Memoria e Transformação, Memory and Transformation, hoping to provide knowledge about the 274 indigenous languages spoken in Brazil, and language retention and retrieval, of course, is of great importance to Indigenous people around the world. In Canada as well, language is the means to interpret and speak the world. Now, despite these gains, museums and galleries, we'll go to the next slide, have failed to retain Indigenous curators who are often isolated and bear the brunt on their shoulders of community building and cultural mediation. Change and integration in Canada's museum sector was argued through the 1990s, codified in the report Turning the Page in 1994, a framework created by the Assembly of First Nations and the Canadian Museum Association. So it gives you get a sense of how many decades this legacy, this attempt has been kind of reverberating. And the American Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, has long existed without any enforcement until very recent times. Experts engaged with museums and galleries emphasize time and time again a series of best practices. Indigenous representation within galleries and museums exhibitions, we'll go to the next slide, enduring formalized partnerships with Indigenous communities, inclusions of cohorts of Indigenous staff and board members, and the adoption of curatorial and pedagogical methods, processes, and timelines provided by Indigenous partners. So this discussion may seem very disconnected from a dialogue about AI, but it's not. Almost every tool set that museums adopt in 2024 has a computational base and aspects of work such as collection, description, standardization, marketing, audience segmentation, and outreach, and it will be, if not already, touched by large language models and AI. An inclusive AI practice must always check for biases in databases, descriptions, exclusions, and invite Indigenous artists working with or creating AI tools into the fold of museums. We also need to work with knowledge keepers, curators, and administrators, and we'll see that AI and indigeneity are not adversarial in any way. Great, we'll go to the next slide. And we'll stay there. Okay, so fundamental to this process is the need for a shift towards Indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous scholars, knowledge bearers, and communities offer constructivist, situated, and relational models from science and culture that can add a significant dimension to transdisciplinary research and to museum practices. While distinct one from another, many Indigenous communities carry a holistic and integrated view of science, technology, and culture, with cultural expressions operating as a means to uncover and represent scientific discovery. Research and museum practice, particularly with technologies, can reach a new threshold in collaboration with Indigenous researchers with a balanced understanding of responsibility, future impact, and temporality. Throughout the world, Indigenous peoples ground themselves in a specificity of place. Appropriate protocol for each nation and territory needs to be understood and used to establish respect for the land, all its life forms, and its people. Indigenous communities use the circle as metaphor and methodology in which well-being and community engagement, consultation, and return of results to the community are fundamental. The relation to knowledge embedded in land, water, and cosmology cannot be overemphasized in the context of the climate crisis. Margaret Elizabeth Kovac, and we'll just see what's at the next slide. Okay, yeah. Great. Margaret Elizabeth Kovac, who is Nitahiwa and Salto, demonstrates that Indigenous approaches to research differ from Western qualitative methods in that they rely on cultural knowledge and languages which are more fluid and are consistently reflexive, i.e. positioning self in context. This fungibility offers a really large challenge to binary computational systems that manage ambiguity poorly. Place positions Indigenous people within relationships to others, to environment, and to language. And Kovac states, quote, Indigenous epistemologies live within a relational web, and all aspects of these must be understood from that vantage point, unquote. Sean Wilson, a Cree writer from northern Manitoba, emphasizes relationality as the core principle of an Indigenous ontology and epistemology, and in turn, accountability. Deborah H. Williams and Garand P. Shipley, in their very comprehensive article, Enhancing Artificial Intelligence with Indigenous Wisdom, describe the ways that multiple Indigenous communities share the concept of relatedness, and I quote them, in Lakota relational ontology, there is the concept, there is the concept of mitakaya oisain, everything is related. Maori philosophy also includes a taxonomy of relationships defined as a genealogy of connection, or wakapapa, in which humans are one species embedded in a network, I quote, of familial relations with ecological place, unquote. In Williams and Shipley's view, it is important to train AI well, described as, quote, value alignments attempts so that AI is encoded with human values in its infancy, and Indigenous ontologies, especially relational dynamics, should be considered as an extension of value alignment. This will offer protection to humans in the future, unquote, presumably as general AI becomes more prevalent and independent of human control. Next slide. Indigenous philosophers have refused the separation between the animate and the inanimate world, between present, past, and future, with its visible and invisible presentation. Greg Cajete, in Native Science, Natural Laws of Interdependence, maintains that science is a living philosophy and not only a mathematical search for truth. He says analysis must seek relationship, and this method draws on ceremony, planting cycles, knowledge of plant and environment, creation and place stories, as well as citing the importance of indigenous languages, again in shaping a new view of science, which uses culture as a resource. So also philosopher and scientist Leroy Littlebear describes a living network comprised of, quote, obviously living things like animals and plants, but equally to seemingly inanimate things like mountains, rivers, and human-made artifacts, unquote. These ideas bear a direct relationship to ways of thinking about artificial intelligence, not as something artificial, but rather as a construct that brings together the animate and inanimate worlds. And we're just going to go to the slide that was before this. Sorry, if we can back up. Indigenous robotics researcher Angie Abdillah poses these possibilities. She says IKS, Indigenous Knowledge Systems, can nudge the existential compartmentalization of Western technoscience into another realm of interrelationship and interconnectedness. Indeed, the current wave of, quote, new materialism, we're going to talk about that in a minute, bears striking resemblance to and could benefit from India Wamara, from the Wiraduni language, a sense of the sacred, to give honor to, show respect, and to do slowly. Matgralgal, Abdillah's relation, who is an initiated loreman and an elder, tells me, she says, that the rock over there does not exist until it's sung into being, and adds that the power of matter into relationship is such that if we stop caring for country dies and we die. End of quote. In pattern thinking, the rock has value, meaning, and place, and so do human beings, and the animal, plant, cosmological, and metaphysical worlds are combined. All things create the complexity of the pattern thinking web in a nuanced relationship of being and knowing that is intertwined. Okay, we'll skip ahead. And on to the next. Yay, stay there, thank you. Ahassi Miskagon Iskiu was a leader in indigenous new media art, theory, and philosophy, and a proponent of zoomorphism, that is, respectful engagement with the non-human world. He emphasized the importance of remembering the genocides of the past while concentrating on the retrieval of nature. He participated in the User Symposium on Authoring Tool Design in 1994, an event that I organized and chaired at the Banff Center, and he argued 30 years ago that authoring tools needed to be, quote, rethought from the perspective of Aboriginal language structure. Cognizant of emerging translational tools, he asked for more, that fundamental creative tools represent Aboriginal worldviews. Ahassi wrote of the ways that Nahawayan expresses, that's Cree language, expresses this philosophy, speaking of language as transformational concepts that ring true in the context of large language models. So I'll just quote from him. He said, saying something is like something else, or saying that something is something else, is an act of magic. Cree language, Nitahiwayan, works on the borders between animate and inanimate, those things that have body and meaning and those that do not. In Cree, the representational acts of metaphor and metonymy, so those two quite different and complex ideas about language, carry with them a weight of responsibility that is anchored in a vast network in which the human is only a small part and sometimes questionable. In Hawaiian, when you say something is like something else, you are representing an awareness, a gift that was given to you to visualize another mesh in the web, to see and hear the transforming. End of quote. Next slide. Great, thank you. John Corbett Nahaiwa Meti, so Cree Métis faculty member at Simon Fraser University, picks up Muskogwin Iskew's call for Indigenous code with the Ancestral Code project within the Indigenous Computing Project, which offers programming context informed by Nahaiwan language and cultural practices to, quote, open new understandings of how programming languages can facilitate a greater sense of personal and digital identity and cultural belonging that go far beyond the purely functional operations of programming, unquote. Corbett applies the concept, quote, for-bodied, unquote, or for spirit from Nahawaian. That is, a people composed of four bodies: the physical, the mental, the emotional, some say the affective, and spirit, to represent Natahaian and Nahaya culture when entering syllabics into the computer, in which he describes as Cree sharp, a relational language. And you can see the representation of the language and his sketch, and then the actual transformation of the keyboard there. Arthur Pachawis reminds us that Indigenous people have been producing technologies for close to 1 million years, including remedies and tools. He defines the global stakes, quote, if we are to survive as a species, there must be a paradigm shift in our approach to life itself, an earth-centered philosophy that brings technological advancement in line with human, animal, and ecological concerns and ethical parameters, unquote. So this is a call to evaluate the technological imagination and innovation through the lens of choices that can be made. An artist and cultural theorist, Jackson Two Bears, writes that Indigenous people often understand, and I quote, technology as something alive and filled with spirit, something with which we were interconnected in what Leroy Little Bear calls a circle of relations, unquote. This is part of a universe of active entities with which people engage. Two Bears remembers that transformers appear in many Indigenous stories, some acting between the living world and spirit world, and he believes that the responsibilities of artists, scientists, and technologists are significant. We can conjure, we can remix powerful spirits with what he describes as unexpected spectral impacts in the world through our inventions. Maori curator, artist, and researcher Mari Mills offers that technology is a tool of Indigenous resilience, cultural continuity, and a conduit for storytelling that draws from, quote, place-based methods, unquote, and she notes that technological research occurs through creative practice and must place, and she says, the ontological, I quote, and epistemological assumptions of the artist-researcher in context, unquote. And research creation is historically, and to this time, a fundamental methodology within Indigenous research practices. So working in community, Lynn Lavalle has discovered, quote, that the method includes sharing circles and symbols such as paintings, drawings, sculptures, crafts, songs, teaching, and stories, unquote, and knowledge is shared through experiential learning or learning by doing. Storytelling serves as memory and methodology. And we'll go to the next image. Beautiful, okay. Scott Benesanwabdin's media and virtual reality work, in his words, seeks, I quote, to address a continuing development and creation of a deeper personal cosmology, the impact of relationships and communal ties, non-conventional ways of knowing, dreaming, intuition, and blood memory, underlying threats and danger inherent in searching for truth, and how these impact and radiate out through the wider community. End of quote. We'll go to the next image. So Indigenous futures and futurism is grounded in Indigenous diversity. It's a multiplex creative movement encompassing fiction, art, cinema, new media that has grown many branches since it was coined by Grace Dillon in 2003. Dillon argues that all forms of Indigenous futurisms, quote, involve discovering how personally one is affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt in our post-native apocalyptic world, unquote. And that's from Chelsea Kelsey Bell. She describes this practice as slipstreaming, so kind of moving between the colonial and the indigenous. And it's a term akin to survivance as defined by indigenous curatorial and cultural theorist Gerald Vizenor, which he says, quote, is an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry, end of quote. And the concept of 7 generations thinking has been adopted by many indigenous communities, including the Anishinaabe of my territory, looking ahead to evaluate decisions considering the deep past and the deep future. Jason Lewis, writing for Public, Indigenous Art, New Media, and the Digital, provided an extensive survey of over a decade of Indigenous futurism on the part of media artists and helpfully provides a taxonomy of practices. These are manifesting the future, imaginings of the future state of Indigenous individuals and communities, hybridizing the present, reimagining of contemporary lives and culture, altering the past, counterfactual narratives that reimagine historical events, often to create more positive contemporary and future realities for Indigenous people, shaping the infrastructure, that is engaging with the infrastructure of the present to bend it in a direction more conducive to Indigenous ontologies. And finally, critiquing the project, so a kind of disciplinary, consistent development of methodologies that reflect on the process through which Indigenous people are populating the future imaginary. So these approaches could be adopted as a curatorial stance, and they're an amazing kind of playbook for museums in some ways. We'll go to the next. Okay, and we'll go to the next. And then we'll go to the next. Okay, and I just want to pause here and say off script, this is Lawrence Paul Waka-Lupton. This is Inherent Rights, Vision Rights. This is a virtual reality piece created by the Banff Center in 1989 to 1992 by Lawrence, and Indigenous maker, incredible painter, and really he was, thinking, using those tools in very early ways. And go to the next image because it really represents. He created working with he called them very primitive technologies, so really early graphics engines. He created the representation and control of how you could move in the space in order to represent different levels of access to the spirits in the longhouse based on whether you were Indigenous or not. So really thinking through who has the right and who doesn't have the right to access this knowledge. We'll go on to the next. Right. Yeah, just a very beautiful image. And go on to the next. And we'll stay here. So artist Skawanati Fragnito has produced a significant series of works in machinima which presage Indigenous futures. For example, She Falls for Ages, which is, I think, the next one. Okay. Actually, yeah, we'll look at this and then we'll go to the next. This is Time Traveler. Okay, we'll stay on She Falls for Ages, and we'll go back to these. In She Falls for Ages, it's a science fiction, quote, retelling of the Haudenosaunee-Iroquois creation story that reimagines Skyworld as a futuristic, utopic space and Sky Woman as a brave astronaut and world builder. She collaborates with Jason Lewis towards AbTech, Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, that is a means to consciously imagine ourselves into and far from the future. And into the future. The past is remade through Indigenous eyes and possible future imaginaries, and Lewis sees AbTech as acting to ground the Indigenous concern for 7 generations of well-being. So AI science reveals the ways that Western science, thinking, philosophy, and evolutionary reductionism place human cognitive capacity at its apex. Seriously flawed imaginary, human-like behaviors and representations, whether agents, robots, replicants, doppelgangers, serve as the platinum standard for design. And companies like Sanctuary AI, out on the west coast of Canada, build hyperhuman models, often repeating gender and racial stereotypes. But there are other ways of imagining robots and AI and agential AI. We're going to go to the next. We're going to look for an image called Cell. Oh, no, this is great. We'll stay here. This is even better. So indigenous thinking aligns closely with arguments by feminist philosopher of science, physicist and ethnicist, a new materialist, we heard that word earlier, Karen Barad. She asserts that researchers need to imagine the world from the point of view of non-human living agents and apply agential realism to embed empathy into science. Haggard and Sonnengrad note that in agential realism, realism is not about something substantialized and fixed or demarcated. Realism instead emphasizes that intraactive agentiality has real effects, effects that become ingredients in new and always open-minded interactive agencies. And Graham Harman notes that the world is not a static, and I quote, a system of relations, but an active doing that first establishes boundaries between apparently discrete things. It is a performative practice, also known as intra-actions, which make an agential cut in the world to generate such boundaries, unquote. In On Touching the Inhuman, that Therefore I Am, Barad states, quote, thinking has never been a disembodied or uniquely human experience, unquote. She goes on, but life, whether organic or inorganic, animate or inanimate, is not an unfolding algorithm. Electrons, molecules, brittle stars, jellyfish, coral reefs, dogs, rocks, icebergs, plants, asteroids, snowflakes, and bees stray from all calculable paths, making leaps here and there, or rather making here and there from leaps, shifting familiarity, pattern practices, testing the waters of what might yet be, have been, could be, still will be, doing thought experiments with their very being. End of quote. So these concepts align with Indigenous AI researchers' acknowledgement that Indigenous knowledge insists on retaining the complexity of lived experience. This is according to Jason Lewis, which can make it seem unruly when viewed from a Western scientific framework that prioritizes climbing a ladder of abstraction to reach simple, universal principles that can be applied across all individuals, communities, and territories. Quote, end of quote. Feminist machine learning AI artist inventor Jane Prophet, here we will go to Cell should be coming up soon. Yep, there you go. Writing with theorist Helen Pritchard, articulates the need to displace and disrupt the notion of machine learning or deep mind as a unified subject. She says artificial's life's single purposeful actor, the agent, is replaced by the agential, an adjective denoting a relationship rather than a subject-object duality, end of quote. And these thoughts on the performative nature of AI and the opportunity for multiple non-human actors provide a very helpful framework for thinking through concepts of the drifts between human and non-human agency in relation to machine learning. And these views suggest the imperative of understanding AI, especially emerging generative AI and generalized AI, and with neural networks, deep learning systems, and LLMs as endowed with another kind of cognitive capacity, a non-human cognitive capacity, but adjacent and complementary. We could imagine a world that prefers freedom of expression of AI identities, proliferation, and biodiversity, not humanoid homogenization. I think there's another very interesting way forward with here, which is to think about writers such as Kate Darling, who wrote a really fantastic book called The New Breed, where she talks about the true potential of robots isn't to recreate what we already have, but is to build a partner in what we are trying to achieve. And she bases all her work in robotics on looking at different levels of animal identity and consciousness. So perhaps the most pressing challenge right in front of us are foundational large language models, which are used to search for sources and summaries of findings, to kickstart a description, to write and edit copy, to understand programming tasks, to call up images, to create a montage or design, and on and on. These are very powerful tools that meld transfer learning with scale of data and compute power, of course burning a huge amount of life energy and in its process, and the potential for gene sequences, finding gaps in existing research, and proposing new paradigms is exciting. However, the challenge, as Rishi Bomasani et al., and the et al. Are about 50 people, point out in their much-cited 2023 article on the opportunities and risks of foundational models. Foundational models lead to homogenization of outputs because of the similarities of training data, and hence the homogenization of research. That said, at least two streams of research have profound opportunities and implications for retaining language and culture and are super important in terms of Indigenous research going forward. As Bamasani et al. Notes, quote, understanding generation as a fundamental aspect of language, studying how to best use and understand foundational models, well, yeah, understanding the ways in which foundational models can increase inequities in NLP, natural language processing, examining whether foundation models can satisfactorily encompass linguistic variation and diversity, and finding ways to draw on human language learning dynamics. So these are significant opportunities. Equally game-shifting in terms of cultural production is the possibility of strengthening robotic foundation models that combine vision and text analytics to more effectively respond to the nuanced nature of human movement. And as LLM reasoning models become more sophisticated, these generalize from data sources across domains which can be powerful, medical imagery analysis, but exclusionary if data sources are not present, diverse data sources are not present. So, you know, this reinforces the Indigenous argument to ensure equally diverse forms of reasoning through access to Indigenous-controlled data. So, SIP. Enter stage left, I think it's stage left. Enter abundant intelligences, stage left. Expanding artificial intelligence through Indigenous knowledge. The network emerged through a series of international conversations, and we'll just go on to another image, see what comes up next. Oh yeah, this is David Rokeby, who was so ahead of large language models in so many ways, so many decades ago, and really embodies that kind of new materialism. We'll go on to the next image. Great, thank you, and on to the next. And we'll just stay there, it's beautiful. And Julie is a member of the network. The network emerged through a series of international conversations over 2 workshops that resulted in the Indigenous Protocol and a artificial intelligence position paper and documentation of visionary short papers and blog entries. They're all available online, should you want to go there. It is now a substantive funded network, international network led by Jason Lewis and Hemi Wanga from New Zealand, comprised of Indigenous researchers, communities in partnership with Ivado, a massive AI and machine learning consortium based in Montreal, at Université de Montréal, and across Canada, Hawaii, New York State, and Aotearoa, which is New Zealand. I'm a member of the steering committee and share information about it both as a researcher in the network and an ally. And my next paragraphs draw pretty directly from the Abundant Intelligence's research rationale, so I'm not going to put quotations everywhere. It's co-written. Abundant Intelligence maintains that the flaws ingrained in the current trajectory of AI development are the results of Western rationalist epistemologies, which embed a series of assumptions about how to create computational systems. These include the user as an individual. The individual prioritizes her personal well-being. Text and context can be separated. Text and context can be separated. I can't underscore how that is a problem. Can be separated. And the only useful knowledge is that produced through rational instrumentality. So AbInt concludes that these weaknesses blind system scientists and engineers to vital aspects of human existence, trust, care, community, that are fundamental, think back to the whole talk about relational research and the world, that are fundamental to how intelligence actually operates, and the goal is to establish new methods for creating advanced computational technologies like AI that will refashion these tools from their current role in systematizing and entrenching colonial practices of exclusion, extraction, and eradication into engines of increasing care of one another in the world. So the term abundant is meant to, quote, invoke imaginaries that sustain and feed everyone, reinforcing how the entire project is grounded in particular territories whose lands nourish us physically and spiritually, as opposed to extraction and over accumulation and indigenous annihilation. Rather, AI systems would be attuned to the end of quote. Rather, AI systems would be attuned to the environments in which they operate, including the cultural structures of specific human communities, their languages, networks, and non-human relationships. The network is steeped in interdisciplinary knowledge. It draws from neuroscience, so Indigenous researchers as well as non-Indigenous in neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, culture, linguistics, and computation in partnership with traditional knowledge keepers. And the network is built on successful but previously uncoordinated initiatives. Angie Abdillah, who you met earlier, and Robert Fitch created Aboriginal songlines for robotics. And Angie describes these. She says, these are deep concepts in robotics that can be quite naturally related to equally deep concepts in the custodianship and transmission of knowledge in IKS. Both place importance on a history of previous experience encoded, such as that which is trusted, timely, and relevant to the situation at hand. End of quote. And they note the similarity of Indigenous knowledge systems to consider terrain and time with challenges in robotics. And she says, pattern recognition is, and I quote, an ethical framework that has sustained and nourished Indigenous communities and countries since the beginning of time, end of quote. So looking towards the future, she sees pattern recognition as transformative for artificial intelligence and robotics researchers' quest to create technology with a sense of humanity, awe, and inspiration, disrupting the prevalence of clocked linear time in our experience of technology. So in abundant intelligence, research is organized into pods that are embedded in labs and then partnered with communities. So the Nitsakake Kanakawana pod undertakes language work with AI scientists and engineers to develop methods for incorporating Nisapi and Haudenosaunee stories in speech, song, and poetry into how large language models actually and AI systems understand the world, and how the underlying computational architectures might need to be reshaped. The Hawaii Pi Anapod is based in Hawaii at CREATE, Immersive Media and Data Visualization Lab at the University of Hawaii, and is centered on soil health and mobilizes traditional knowledge as well as deep learning. And the Aotearoa Pod is co-hosted at Indigenous Design and Innovation at Aotearoa in Wellington, Massey University in Palmerston North, and is supported by Te Hiku Media, which is a community-based organization in Katawa. And they mobilize AI technology to explore the centrality of hapu, kinship groups, and connection in creative language, cultural, and well-being contexts. And the ultimate goal is to develop an AI that brings a more holistic Maori-centric picture of language, culture, health, well-being, Wakapapa, we heard about it earlier, genealogical connection, connected to Maori data and data sets. So this ability to look back in time offers an AI with advanced environmental analytic skills and has been described by Maori research as the iwi algorithm, quote, the re-understanding of our ancient relationship with emotional, natural, and social capital, unquote. And it's centered on language preservation. And processes in Aboriginal intelligence, in ABINT start with the intensive sharing of Indigenous knowledge models and science. That's the first stage. Then there's collaborative research planning through a highly collaborative system of project generation, and all projects work with youth within Indigenous communities. And fundamental to abundant intelligence are CARE and OCAP principles of data sovereignty. These are driven by two frameworks, CARE, which is developed by the Global Indigenous Alliance, and OCAP in Canada. And these are required now in any research grant working with Indigenous people in Canada. The CARE principles are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And they were developed in response to, you'll probably all be familiar with FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable principles of the open data movement. And so they're being used for using tribal data encodes genomics research and Indigenous data governance of ecology and biodiversity research and data. But CARE basically focuses on people with the goal of using data to advance Indigenous innovation and self-determination. And these are principles that also are in partnership with FAIR to bring the two together and always have a balance in decision-making. And then the principles that are OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, assert that First Nations have control over data collection processes in their own communities, and that they own and control how information can be stored, interpreted, used, or shared. So it really means retaining ownership. So this is a very important concept, or ownership reverting to Indigenous communities. In the instance of abundant intelligences, this has meant creating agreements that restrict access to ceremonial data, working with communities who are partners to ensure they have the means to collect and hold data, right? Or that when data is stored within the universities, museums, or other partners, there's clear provenance and governance, reproducibility is limited, and that there are repatriation agreements surrounding the data. So, these issues resonate particularly strongly in the museum sector because data repatriation should be as vital a force as the repatriation of physical objects to ensure that Indigenous imagery, language, stories, rituals are not propagated, as they already are, without permission. So I want to very briefly just walk through a few projects that create or reconsider data in ways that have direct value to museums seeking to build relationships with Indigenous and other marginalized groups and respect, care, and ICAP principles. Go to the next image. Yeah, another amazing work that really looks at the relationship between land and identity. We'll go to the next. This is just a reminder for us about, okay, and we'll stay here happily looking at large language models. Okay, so Gerald McMaster, Canada Research Chair, Tier 1, is the director of the Wapata Centre for Indigenous Visual Knowledge. He's principal investigator and professor at OKU. He's a Canada Research Chair, as I said, and he's long been involved in looking at the cross-fertilization between Western and Indigenous cultures and exploring the ways that geographically separate Indigenous cultures share philosophies and practices. Most recently, an amazing exhibition, public artworks, etc., and a book, Amazon Arctic, through a series of residencies, public art, and exhibitions, just to repeat myself. So one of his initiatives is the Virtual Platform for Indigenous Art, VPIA. It's a digital platform for Indigenous communities, international researchers of Canadian Indigenous art, and collecting institutions to share and exchange access to collections of Indigenous artifacts. It's a collaborative project. It's a digital gathering place for data on historical and contemporary Indigenous art and artifacts from over 92 international institutions and museums through reciprocal research partnership. It includes the Mukarta content management system to build an accessible, user-friendly, and findable database that also secures Indigenous ownership of work, tracks the work, and allows borrowing and exchange, drawing from using a range of technologies like blockchain. It's an international coalition, including the Haida Nation, the Haida Gwaii Museum, U of T, Robarts Library, Six Nations, University of Aberdeen, and Brown University. In another initiative, Building a Data Fluent Culture, it's one of mine, in collaboration with Synapse from Quebec, we're creating a catalog of cultural data sources at the municipal, regional, provincial, and national levels. We're identifying data types, provenance, governance, and rights issues. And it's particularly important for Indigenous and other marginalized groups for us to point towards data they can share within their own networks and to provide clear guidance following the OCAP principles regarding the kinds of data available to other researchers as a way to include rights. I'll keep going to the next slide. Yeah, this is just a beautiful robot that goes into communities and provides language training in Australia. And then the next. Okay, yay. So last slide, and then if there's time, we'll just go online and I'll show you this. So I lead a project called Crossing Fawns. Do note there's a symposium, and it's hybrid, so you can attend it. either physically or hybrid. So this project has created relationships, sown relationships between diverse archives as sites of research and knowledge production. The focus is on the emergence and potentials of digital archives. While appearing to be disembodied, archives contain lived experiences of actual bodies, according to Battaglia, and interfaces that need to be understood as dynamic and lively. So, scholars engaged with Indigenous decolonization and reconciliation and philosophy have really initiated fruitful reevaluations of archives, their histories of collection and provenance, to highlight what Caswell calls symbolic annihilation. So on the other hand, the digital forum for archives can create incredible access. The practice of critical archival studies involves donors and community members in the description and exhibition of their archival materials, shaping the ways that their records are understood. It occurs through close reading of specific archives and fonds within the context of nation states and global patterns, migration, through structural analysis of collections, collecting practices and gaps, and when appropriate through visualization, as well as attention to and through linguistic analysis of metadata. So interventions include rethinking attribution and provenance, metadata redescription and description modification capacity, and being able to even do that at the item level and have the ability of communities to comment on objects and items. So that's essentially what we're doing. So we've built a platform. It's a replicable open source data archive ecosystem to facilitate individual and collaborative study, creation, and critique, including self-reflection. It includes researchers from the Black community, Dr. Anda Fatona, a scholar of Black Canadian diaspora, and Indigenous communities, artist Anna Claxton and Carmen Cray, and community partners. So as I mentioned, we do have this symposium that is coming up. So I'm going to just summarize very quickly the points. If there's time, I'll show you the platform. And so really, what are the actions that we need to take? Like, how do these strands come together? Museums, the museum terrain, the co-musealization, I love that term from Brazil, the integration of Indigenous curators and educators, reevaluating collections and data. Second, Indigenous worldviews, philosophy of relationality and responsibility. And third, the escalating capacity and wave of AI. Each of these requires keeping the human in the loop, building presence inside the museum and in alliances and communities, and sustaining a focus on collective human and environmental needs, and a deep, unorthodox exchange of knowledge. Data is critical to each of these strands, whether describing a collection, data resulting from traditional knowledge practices, or training sets for AI and ML models. Museums need a rigorous data governance and now AI governance regime, coupled with the engagement of communities and active commentary on existing data. Museums can bring traditional knowledge keepers, Indigenous artists, and researchers to the table as they begin to explore the adoption of AI and other emerging technologies. Creating a responsible but experimental laboratory, as we heard in the introductory presentations this morning, to engage with AI is a gift to many communities. Language is fundamental to Indigenous knowledge transmission and survivance, and AI tools to support language preservation and learning represent a tremendous opportunity, as does the translation of exhibitions into Indigenous languages or from Indigenous languages into settler languages. And collaborations between Indigenous researchers and institutions, including museums, require an ethics of care, protocol, attention and time to process, respect for community and place, and the understanding that objects bear life and culture. Understanding how these concepts apply to Indigenous-produced AI systems, agents, and AGI will be an existing, abundant, intelligent challenge for the near future. So the application, I've said it before, of Indigenous knowledge must occur with Indigenous peoples at the table. In the extension of the term, nothing about us without us, I am here with permission of my abundant intelligence colleagues to tell you about our research. I'd love to show you, if you can flip out of the slides and just go to the website. Great. So this is the website. You can go online and you can explore it. So it gives you the whole framework of the platform we're building, and then we'll just go to very quickly to the next website. Thanks. Okay, so this is our space. This is our place space. It's built on Omega S, for those of you who are archive geeks. And there's 3 case studies. And if you just go to the first one and open the women at the table. Great. Click on that. Great. And you can see how we've organized item sets here. And so if you just click on HRU 1930s, 1940s. Great. And if you just zoom down, you can see, you can see that there's many item sets. They're from different archives. This is the point. They're assembled from 6 different archives, including Labor History Archive, Community Archive, Black Archive collecting people's stories, and then municipal and university archives. And then there's 4 item subsets. If you actually click on an item, you can add commentary to it, and you can add suggestions for the metadata and how you'd like to see it. So those are the functions we've built out. We will be creating visualization between items and between how they coexist from different archives. So thank you. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to talking.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very intensive presentation. There's so much to glean from your presentation and all the case studies that you shared. ¿Se oye bien? Sí. Ay, gracias. So I'll dive right into it. I made some notes. I hope I can understand them. But first of all, I'll adopt your term apocalyptic. Maybe we can survive the apocalypse in style. I'd like to talk a little bit about the 7th generation approach and indigenous knowledge systems, which I thought was a beautiful idea. And you mentioned that it was adopted by several indigenous communities. Yes. You have described indigenous worldviews, not only you, obviously, but many researchers, as holistic, relational, situated worldviews, right? In the 7th generation approach, it seems to me that institutions would do great to adopt similar strategies. But my question would be if it's possible for institutions, and I'm not talking only about cultural institutions, to adopt indigenous knowledge without it becoming yet again another Western appropriation and misuse. And I think you said at the end, nothing about us without us, and I think that's a great approach to it. And I'll add another layer to this, and it's a difficult subject matter, an ongoing discussion in Canada and elsewhere, and in Mexico as well too. Because indigenous knowledge systems are many times, and as you described it, place-based and situated knowledges. How can institutions bridge the issue of land that communities that have been dispossessed, institutions that are often in these lands, and where land acknowledgement, and you said it yourself, we have not even acknowledged where we are situated right now. When this is not sufficient, how is this being bridged, and how can we go forward? And I wanted to add a little bit, sorry to have a convoluted argument, but I was thinking of holistic and relational approaches, and wondering if perhaps it's possible for Western-based traditions and philosophies and indigenous-based knowledge to sort of meet halfway and build forward. For example, using similar echoing philosophies like actor network theory that could be on equal footing with indigenous knowledge and to together bring forth new systems of building knowledge.
Sure. Those are a series of excellent questions, and let's proceed through them one by one. So thinking about first generation into seventh generation. So the idea of seventh generation forward thinking is very much based in ideas of being situated in history, but in historical knowledge, and it is remembering in some way that there has been this genocide of indigenous people, but it's with the philosophy of survivance, which is that there's this incredible capacity to bring the culture forward. You know, people talk about it as blood memory. It's also intellectual, it's linguistic, it's cultural. So it's also going back before contact to look at, you know, what are the remnants of those histories. So the seventh generation thinking is historically grounded, so I think it's important to say that. And then it's looking at every decision that you make to step back and take the time to start to ask the questions, you know, what does this mean in 7 generations? And if you think about 7 generations being, you know, at the very least, if people's lifespan is, in many indigenous communities, 50 years, it's 350 years. But in a kind of average context, so let's think about it as you know, 500 years. That's really a significant responsibility. And then there's some communities that have a sort of cycle of 7 generations where they've kind of applied it back to say, which generation are we in? And there's sort of this movement through different generational forms of knowledge. There's also ways of understanding effective maturity. That's also, Oak Ridge University has a whole way of thinking about curriculum through the lens of 4 stages of life. So that's very popular within the kind of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and those ideas kind of get put together with 7 generations. So when you think ahead, like what are the levels of mature, if you want something to realize in 7 generations, how does it mature for process? So how do you think about its future? And then also how do you think prophylactically, like let's not do this because of its implications, right? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is institutions and decolonization. You know, this is a very messy, difficult conversation. That could be like a panel in its own or a whole conference, and there are. You know, there's a sort of utopian hope of decolonization. Our institutions are so fundamentally built on certain kinds of histories and practices that you can create parallel practices within and disruptions, and you can reorder and reorganize some ways of doing and thinking and knowing. And you can create what you're describing, which is described by some scholars as two ways of seeing two-eyed knowledge, which is that you find the compatibility between the indigenous and the Western, and you do that explicitly and consciously. And we have people in Canada who are the Métis people, and they've definitely brought together, you know, knowledge that came from sort of, you know, France and that whole legacy and history, and various white cultures, you know, with Cree and other nations, particularly in Western Canada. So that hybridization is something that Indigenous people talk about a lot. I mean, Gerald McMaster's work is completely based on hybridization, that exchange. And it's not something that I see as being refused by many Indigenous people, but they just really want to know what the rights are and how those are established in that process. In fact, the whole goal of abundant intelligence is hybridization. I mean, we're working with MILA, you know, top-ranking AI institute, one of the top ones in the world. So it's not to segregate that knowledge, it's who gets to use it and to acknowledge those pathways and histories. So I think it's important to, so one thing I will say, and I did this when I was president at OKDU, is I led what were called cluster hires, where we brought in groups of Indigenous faculty, and we also did that with Black cluster hires. So what it meant was that people were not alone when they came into the institution, and they built their own community and culture, and they had support to do that. So that's question 2.5, 3, land. Land is difficult. You know, land is, those histories are here, right? So part of the work is extracting the history. It's saying, what has happened, you know, in this vast city of Mexico City, DF? Where are those histories located? How can we memorialize them and maybe bring them to life too in terms of the core things that have happened here? How can we work with the current peoples here to make those lands sacred again in some way? And then for institutions, I think it's a really interesting project to know who has been here and if those are still surviving people, and can you build a relationship with those people? Museums all through North America have been doing that. You know, they have collections from people who were dispossessed off those places, and they're actually bringing them back in, you know, and they're meeting with them, they're creating those relationships. So land is I think urban land is super important and interesting, you know, and urban, indigenous people are well organized in our cities, and you can create relationships with them. So I think the museum has to go out too, I will say. You know, I think, you know, having partnership extensions like Gerald's work with Haida Gwaii, you know, and those institutions have strong relationships with sited places on the land, on the territory, but they're working with other museums around the world, indigenous and non-indigenous. Did I get everything?
I think so, yes.
Okay. It's a memory test. I'm not that young.
We might need some coffee in a minute.
Yeah.
You spoke about hybridization, and I was really struck by the ideas around indigenous futurism and how the present can be molded into this hybrid form, but also how the past can be retooled to bring about new narratives going forward that don't re-victimize or own indigenous histories of colonialism and dispossession, and those legacies can in fact be transformed. So I think essentially this is a very hopeful message, and I really enjoyed reading that and hearing about it.
I think it is optimistic. I think it's also super fascinating. I mean, it's this kind of game theory stuff. Like if this was the set of what a lot, you know, indigenous futurism. These are not the only cultures doing this work, right? It's also somewhat of a mainstream practice to say, well, if this happened in this war, and if these people won, what would happen, right? So, but I think in this context where it's so much about optimism and bringing cultures forward that have been so deeply victimized and continue to be in the Canadian context and in many places. It's about really asserting that kind of resilience and reimagining possibilities. And then once you have that, you don't have to fix that part of the past. You have to take that forward.
Yes, thinking more about colonial legacies and restitution and dispossession, and I'm thinking more of the data aspect of your presentation, and I might not do the more technical aspects justice because the large language models, but I'll talk about data for a little bit. Historically, for indigenous communities, the recopilation of data regarding their cultures has been part and parcel of the colonial process of acculturation and obliteration of cultural specificities. And if you pair that with contemporary data colonialism and data extractivist practices of digital, big tech, digital platforms, large and small, it paints for like a very harrowing picture of not trusting where the information is stored, how it will be used or misused or instrumentalized against the peoples and not for their benefit. Is OCAP, and you mentioned it briefly, but maybe you can expand on that, and care strategies, are they a response to these historical and current situations?
100%. Yeah, they are. And it's really fascinating when you start to put them into practice, because I said on the Abundant Intelligence Steering Committee, sat for hours looking at the Concordia University, just typical project partnership agreement with my colleagues and just ripping it apart clause by clause. to say, what does this mean in terms of data? Who gets the data? How are they defining intellectual property? So it's very much, like I think there's a fundamental conundrum that is a big debate, not only in the Indigenous community, but other marginalized communities, about whether to contribute their controlled data to training data. Because it's really difficult. If you don't, it doesn't get better. If you do, it gets ripped. So, you know, part of what is certainly part of the conversation is the role of the university and non-commercial actors within developing this next level of AI, because universities at least can play some role in thinking through those problems and trying to resolve them, and even creating maybe parallel open source systems. But even the question about whether to open source an LLM it's because then who gets to rip it and use it, right? So, we went through years and years and years where we'd have fantastic research in universities and university labs. It would get commercialized. University labs would get kind of put behind. But they'd leap ahead with the next role. In this one, the commercial competition is so brutalist that, and it's so much based on training data in part, it's very difficult. So I don't have an easy answer to this. I mean, but it's a huge conversation. So I know within these communities we're working with, the question is, what is the data set? What are the data sets going to be that they use, that they keep, they protect? What other data sets do they bring in? And how do they deal with that with Melia, where you're dealing with, Yasu Benjamin, like people who've invented a lot of these systems? It's just an ongoing conversation. But of course, these are, so it's also a reaction to academic researchers stealing Indigenous data, going into communities constantly, not consulting with the community, building their careers on Indigenous data, and also artifacts and images, and then these data sets that governments have on Indigenous people, which are just incredible. Like Inuit have a number, right? So your life is a number.
Yes, yeah. And we've seen historically these databases, phrenology, how they've been implemented. Yeah. So it is pretty scary, I'm sure. Yeah. But I'm left with a sense that it is possible to build an AI that is inclusive, that involves, that is created by and for and by Indigenous communities, and that going forward we won't be left with these models that are like completely biased and exclusive of the diversity.
We'll at least hopefully be able to choose.
I think I'm going to open up the floor to questions. Queremos escucharles, preguntas del público, por favor. Si en línea, en el canal de YouTube hay preguntas, nos gustaría escucharles. Por acá tenemos una pregunta. Sí, Guillermo.
Hi there. Well, first I just want to say thank you for that mind-blowing presentation, and it left me, and I'm sure all of us, thinking deeply. That's why we're wondering specifically what to ask, where to even start. But you mentioned how a lot of AI models are focused on rationalized Western means of perceiving time and space in a more progressive, linear way, and how that also is reflected in language acquisition and language models, and how language is understood and learned by these AI language processors. So I was wondering if you could maybe, if it's possible, mention a bit more about how this means of another way of perceiving time through language could be a way to propose alternatives for these new models of language and linguistic understanding to create a more diverse means of understanding and collecting data, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic question, and it's so much the premise of a lot of the research that's going to happen, at least in parts of abundant intelligence. And I have to also say that LLMs are getting smarter and smarter. Like, you know, a year ago they were really crappy at contextual analytics, and now they're its ability to understand context is strengthening. But there's still this kind of categorization, also a lot with the kind of visual tools. I don't know if you've worked with any of them. You know, there's sort of the Baroque, the this, the that. There's this sort of typology problem because the typologies are pulled so much from Western cultural practices and the database. So I'm not directly answering what you're saying, but one of the things to do would be to really look at why the ontology discussion is so important. Sorry, swigging back the water, is to be able to create taxonomies that are way more dynamic and representative of ways of understanding the world and being able to cluster types of language expressions within those, like, for example, emotional or affective or subjective, right? So that's certainly one strategy. Another piece of work, though, is to, and I think you saw it with the Cree-Sharp example, is to rethink, and there's another beautiful language project at the National Research Centre in Canada, but it's building circular associations, like almost using a visualization structure that creates kind of relationships between different words and terms that's nonlinear. So it kind of goes back and seeks a sort of temporal reflection on a word, which would pull back an image from a previous time, as opposed to moving forward always in time. So those are two. I tried to build something years ago which analyzed text using a set of qualitative terms or methods out of effective expression in text, and then express those as patterns and images. The article that I cited, which was looking at that, sort of robotic looks at that. It really looks at deep time. It looks at song lines as a mode of organizing data and experience. So, yeah. I could go on and on in this not very articulate way, so I'll stop.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for the presentation. This is a very concrete question. In this network that you build in alliance with these indigenous communities, how is your relationship, or how do you deal with the Canadian state? I'm asking this because in Mexico, talking about appropriation, Mexican state is the ultimate appropriationist of indigenous communities in Mexico, whether it's from objects to knowledge. So I was wondering, how is your relationship with the state in this case?
So you saw some of the documents. I mean, there's been task force after task force, Royal Commission after Royal Commission, more recently Truth and Reconciliation, the murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is an ongoing problem. So, governments have recognized, governments brought in and militantly supported assimilation through a genocidal strategy, which were the residential schools in Canada, which is just a stunning history. It's like, when you immerse in it, it's just the level of pain and the ongoing impacts are just, it's unspeakable. So that was a government project. And then and all the way through the Trudeau era, right, the first Trudeau era. And then you start to have this massive waves of radicalization of Indigenous people in Canada. And it is a significant population, I think, as it is in Mexico. The U.S. killed off most of their Indigenous people, so very small percentage of the population. They're still activists. But in Canada, it's a significant growing population. And so, these waves of activism and the kind of conditions that have existed in Canada too, and people, not just Indigenous people, being aware of it, have put pressure on governments to change policy and to try and rectify some of what has happened. Now, it is very complicated. You had the federal government fighting, again, there's this huge fostering out of children. Children are forced into foster care. And foster children and Indigenous kids on reserve get half the amount of medical care as white kids. So there was a big court case. In the midst of all this great positive change of legislation, the federal government still fought the court case. So I would say it's contradictory, but the conditions in Canada are recognition of this issue and these questions, support it for the museum sector to take action, funding for some of that, and changes of practice is in the museum sector, and some significant work at repatriation. But there's a change in ideology that just really came from Indigenous people being activist. So, that's what I mean about allyship. It's about building those partnerships and fighting the government on these questions, right?
Thank you.
¿Tenemos más preguntas del público o en línea? I think that's it. That's it for now. Thank you, Sarah, very, very much for a very powerful presentation and an opening of this encounter. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias a todos y yo creo que entonces vamos a la pausa.
Thank you.